At 4:47 a.m. Tehran time, something happened that intelligence agencies around the world noticed immediately, and that none of them had a clean explanation for. Every established communication channel between Iran and the outside world went quiet. Not slowly, not partially, all at once, in a way that suggested deliberate, coordinated action rather than technical failure. The diplomatic hotlines that various countries maintain with Iranian counterparts stopped receiving responses. The back channels that have existed for years between Iranian and American officials through Omani and Swiss intermediaries went dark. Iranian state media, which normally broadcasts around the clock, shifted to a loop of religious programming and patriotic music that regional analysts recognize immediately. It's what Iranian state television plays when the government is managing a major internal situation and doesn't want to say anything publicly until it has decided what to say. The silence lasted 6 hours, and in those 6 hours, every government with stakes in the current conflict experienced something close to controlled panic. Because in the language of geopolitical confrontation, sudden silence from a nuclear threshold state in the middle of a military crisis is one of the most alarming signals that exists. We've been in tense standoffs with Iran before. We've seen Iranian rhetoric ratchet up to levels that seemed impossible to walk back. We've seen Iranian military posturing that appeared to be the prelude to direct action. But we have not seen this before. A complete, deliberate communications blackout from a government that normally maintains multiple overlapping channels of contact with the outside world, precisely because those channels serve its interests. The fact that Iran chose to go silent rather than to shout is what has intelligence analysts in Washington, London, Tel Aviv, and Riyadh most unsettled. Shouting is what governments do when they want to be heard. Silence is what governments do when they're making decisions they're not ready to announce. To understand what the silence might mean, you have to understand the structure of Iranian decision-making, which is unlike the decision-making structure of most other governments that America deals with. Iran is not a simple autocracy where one man makes all the decisions. It's a complex system with multiple power centers: the Supreme Leader's Office, the IRGC command structure, the regular military, the civilian government under the president, the clerical establishment, the intelligence services. And major decisions require a degree of coordination among these competing power centers that takes time, and that is kept internal until a consensus is reached. When Iran goes silent externally, it's usually because there's an intensive internal debate underway. The government is talking to itself, and it has decided that whatever it's discussing internally should not be visible to the outside world until the outcome of that discussion is known. What are the possible conclusions of that internal debate? This is where analysis has to be honest about the limits of what we can know from the outside. The optimistic interpretation of the silence is that Iran's pragmatic faction, the diplomats, the economists, the officials who understand the devastating cost of a full military confrontation with the United States, is winning the argument. That the silence is the sound of Iran searching for a face-saving formula, a way to pull back from the brink without publicly appearing to have backed down. Every political system needs exit ramps from confrontation that don't look like retreats. Iran's internal political culture is particularly sensitive to this because the entire ideological foundation of the Islamic Republic is built on resistance to foreign pressure. A government that appears to capitulate to American ultimatums faces genuine legitimacy questions that could threaten the regime itself. So, if Iran is going to de-escalate, it has to do it in a way that can be narrated domestically as a strategic choice, not a defeat. That narrative takes time to construct. The silence could be the construction process. The pessimistic interpretation of the silence is that Iran's hardline faction has won the internal argument and is now in the final stages of planning a military action that it doesn't want to telegraph. Military operations benefit from surprise. If Iran is preparing something significant, a massive missile barrage, an attempt to close the Strait of Hormuz, a coordinated activation of proxy forces across the region, the last thing Iranian commanders would want is for their intentions to be visible in their communications. The silence on this reading is operational security before a major action. Intelligence agencies are watching Iranian military movements on the ground with satellite imagery, signal intercepts, and human intelligence to try to determine which interpretation is correct. From what has filtered through to analysts outside the classified world, the picture is mixed. There are some indicators that suggest preparation for action. There are others that suggest negotiation. The ambiguity is not reassuring. There is a third interpretation that is less discussed but potentially important. The silence could be the result of internal chaos rather than internal deliberation. The Iranian political system has been under extraordinary stress for years. The economy is badly damaged by sanctions. The population is restive. There have been multiple waves of significant protests in recent years. The hardliners and pragmatists have been engaged in escalating internal conflict that has sometimes spilled into public view. A government under this kind of internal pressure, suddenly facing the prospect of a full military confrontation with the United States, may not be capable of the kind of coherent decision-making that either the optimistic or pessimistic interpretations assume. It may, instead, be paralyzed. The supreme leader, now in his mid-80s and reportedly in declining health, may be physically or cognitively unable to provide the decisive leadership the moment requires. The IRGC commanders may be pushing for action that the civilian leadership cannot endorse. The result could be a government that is simultaneously unable to attack and unable to negotiate, frozen at the moment when the decisions it makes will matter most. What is the outside world doing during the silence? Every government with a stake in the outcome is doing something, even if what they're doing is invisible. The Americans are using every back channel they have, and they have several that operate outside normal diplomatic structures, to try to make contact with anyone in the Iranian system who might be reachable. The Swiss, who represent American interests in Tehran in the absence of a formal diplomatic relationship, have been instructed to make contact at the highest level they can reach. The message being sent, according to sources familiar with the effort, is essentially this: we are still willing to talk, the door is not closed, but the window is narrowing, and we need to hear from you. Whether that message is getting through to anyone with actual decision-making authority in Tehran is unknown. The Israelis, meanwhile, are in a different mode entirely. They are treating the silence as a potential indicator of imminent Iranian military action, and are conducting themselves accordingly, placing additional air defense units on full alert, repositioning Iron Dome batteries, and preparing pilots and aircraft for a possible large-scale interception mission. The Israeli posture is essentially, we are not going to be surprised. If Iran is preparing to launch, Israel intends to know about it before the first missile leaves its launcher. Saudi Arabia and the UAE are doing something that doesn't get enough attention in Western coverage. They are activating their own channels into the Iranian system. Both countries have, in recent years, conducted direct diplomatic engagement with Iran. Saudi Arabia and Iran restored diplomatic relations in a Chinese-brokered agreement in 2023, and while those relations have since become strained by the current conflict, the channel still technically exists. Whether anyone in Tehran is answering the phone from Riyadh is unclear, but the Saudis are trying. They have strong incentives to. A full-scale military conflict in the Persian Gulf affects Saudi Arabia's energy infrastructure, its oil revenues, its regional stability, and its relationship with both America and China simultaneously. Riyadh is not a disinterested spectator. Russia is also attempting to use its relationship with Tehran. The Kremlin has maintained better access to the Iranian leadership than almost any other major power throughout the current crisis, partly because Russia has been a supplier of weapons and diplomatic support to Iran, and partly because both countries share a deep suspicion of American intentions. Russian officials have been in contact with their Iranian counterparts, and Moscow has been urging de-escalation, not out of altruism, but out of a calculation that an Iranian military catastrophe would reduce Russian leverage in the region and potentially generate the kind of instability that even Russia finds inconvenient. The communications infrastructure that Iran has now gone silent on is worth examining in some detail, because it tells you something about the deliberateness of what's happened. Iran maintains multiple overlapping communication channels with the outside world precisely because it has learned, through hard experience, that single channels can be compromised, monitored, or cut off. There are official diplomatic channels through the Iranian Foreign Ministry, which maintains relationships with dozens of countries even amid the current tension. There are informal back channels that have existed for years, some of them involving business intermediaries, some involving religious scholars who have relationships on both sides, some involving diaspora communities that maintain connections to the homeland. There are intelligence-to-intelligence channels that exist outside the formal diplomatic structure. And there are the intermediary channels, Oman, Switzerland, Qatar, and others, that serve as conduits when direct communication is politically impossible. For all of these channels to go quiet simultaneously requires a deliberate decision at a very high level of the Iranian system. This was not a technical failure. This was a choice. The silence has its own message, even if that message is ambiguous. In the language of statecraft, going silent communicates several things simultaneously. It communicates that Iran has entered a phase of decision-making that it regards as internal and not subject to outside input. It communicates that whatever Iran says next will be the product of a resolved internal process rather than an ongoing negotiation. It communicates, perhaps most importantly, that Iran does not feel obligated to respond to outside pressure on a timeline set by others, that Iran will speak when Iran is ready to speak, and not before. That last element is worth taking seriously. One of Trump's signature negotiating tactics is the use of time pressure, the ultimatum, the deadline, the countdown. Iran's decision to go silent is, among other things, a refusal to accept American control of the timeline. It's a way of saying, you don't set the clock, we do. Whether that communication is defiance born of confidence or defiance born of desperation is the question that nobody outside Tehran can currently answer. The markets have noticed the silence. In the hours since Iranian communications went dark, oil prices have spiked further. Gold is up. Defense stocks continue their climb. The VIX, the so-called fear index that measures expected volatility in financial markets, is at levels not seen since the peak of the COVID pandemic. Financial markets, as we've noted before, are imperfect but highly sensitive instruments for aggregating information and expectations from millions of participants simultaneously. What they're telling you right now is that the probability of a major escalation has increased, not decreased in the past several hours. The silence in the market's collective assessment is not reassuring, it is alarming. What breaks the silence? That's the question everyone is asking. There are several possible triggers. An internal decision could be reached and communicated, either a decision to stand down and negotiate or a decision to act militarily. External events could force a response, an American military action, an Israeli strike, a development in another part of the region that changes the strategic picture in Tehran. Time could simply pass. Governments under pressure eventually feel the need to say something, if only to manage domestic audiences who are also in the dark. Or an intermediary could successfully reach someone in the Iranian leadership and establish a private channel that, while not publicly visible, allows enough communication to begin de-escalating without either side having to make a public statement that constrains its options. Of these possibilities, the last one is probably the one that diplomatic officials in multiple capitals are most actively pursuing and most hopeful about. A private channel doesn't require either side to show its hand. It doesn't require public commitments. It just requires someone on the Iranian side to pick up the phone. And the anxious, uncertain silence that currently exists between Tehran and the world is, at its core, waiting to find out if anyone will. The world has been here before. Not exactly here, but in the vicinity. There have been moments in modern history when a nuclear threshold state went silent in the middle of a crisis, and the silence resolved in different ways. Sometimes the silence ended with a diplomatic breakthrough. Sometimes it ended with an action that nobody had predicted. The Cuban Missile Crisis had moments of silence that terrified American officials, precisely because they understood that the silence might be concealing Soviet decision-making that was heading toward a catastrophic conclusion. In that case, the silence eventually broke in the right direction. There's no law of history that says it always does. What we know, sitting here, watching the clocks and the satellite feeds and the oil prices and the military readiness indicators, is that the silence cannot last indefinitely. Something is being decided in Tehran. When that decision becomes visible, through a statement, through an action, through a leaked message from an intermediary, it will define everything that comes next. Until then, we wait. And the waiting is one of the most dangerous phases of any crisis, because waiting under enough pressure has a tendency to end not with the wisest possible choice, but with whatever choice the pressure has made feel most urgent.